Plus, the room fell silent as she took a deep breath, her eyes filled with both guilt and determination. "There's something you need to know," she began, her voice trembling. What followed was a revelation so shocking it shattered everything I thought I knew. A dark secret from the past that unraveled the very fabric of trust and exposed the truth that had been hidden for years. In that moment, everything changed, and the path forward became a battle for redemption and justice. But before we dive into the story, let me know where you're watching this from in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next one. Carlos had always been a man of routine. The orderly rhythm of surgeries and consultations provided him with a sense of stability. But Sylvia had introduced chaos into his once predictable life. Her late-night meetings, evasive answers, and an increasingly distant demeanor gnawed at him. When she wasn't home by 10 p.m., he used to worry. Now, he braced himself for whatever excuse she would craft upon her return. Sylvia had started spending more time with Pete Wallace, a charismatic pharmaceutical executive and a recent addition to the hospital board. At first, Carlos dismissed her involvement with Pete as purely professional. But over the past few weeks, the frequency of these strategic planning sessions had escalated. When Carlos gently probed, Sylvia's responses became curt. "Do we really have to do this every time I work late, Carlos?" she snapped one night when he questioned her schedule. Her tone was sharp, her eyes daring him to push further. "You're being paranoid." That word lingered with Carlos, bitter and accusing. It wasn't paranoia, it was pattern recognition, something he'd relied on for years in the operating room. He'd ushered him to his end of the seat. The tipping point came on a rare evening when Sylvia had left her phone charging on their shared kitchen counter. She was upstairs getting ready for yet another hospital dinner. Carlos, still seated at the counter, saw the phone screen light up with a notification from a messaging app. His name wasn't on the preview. Instead, a snippet of the conversation between Sylvia and Pete made his breath catch. "This lit dress will be perfect for the party. Can't wait to see everyone's reaction. Especially Carlos's." Yeah. The casual intimacy of the text made Carlos's chest tighten. His hands hovered over the phone, hesitation warring with the sick need to know more. He tapped the screen, and the full thread unfolded. Messages told a story he wasn't ready to accept. "You've been incredible, Sylvia. That presentation was flawless. Let's celebrate soon, just the two of us." Pete, stop. Someone might see these texts. "Relax. Carlos is too busy being a surgeon to notice anything." The words burned into Carlos's memory. He stared at the screen, unable to reconcile the flirtatious banter with the woman he thought he knew. Even the casual mentions of work felt like veiled references to something deeper, something inappropriate. Sylvia came downstairs, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. She wore the slit dress Pete had referenced, its deep red fabric clinging to her as if to flaunt her defiance. She stopped short when she saw Carlos holding her phone. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice sharp and defensive. Carlos set the phone down carefully, his hand steady despite the storm of emotions brewing inside him. "It was open," he said, his tone deceptively calm. "Interesting conversation with Pete." Sylvia's eyes widened, then narrowed. "You're checking up on me now? Going through my messages like I'm one of your interns?" "I didn't have to go through anything," Carlos said, his voice quiet but resolute. "You left it open, Sylvia. I'm just connecting the dots." For a moment, the air between them was electric, heavy with unspoken accusations and barely restrained anger. Sylvia grabbed her phone, her movements quick and agitated. "This is exactly why I don't tell you anything," she said, her voice rising. "You're always looking for something to control. My job, my time, my life." "And Pete?" Carlos's question was simple but devastating. Sylvia's composure cracked. "This is ridiculous," she spat, brushing past him toward the door. "I don't have time for your insecurities. I have a fundraiser to attend." As the door closed behind her, Carlos stood in the empty kitchen, his reflection staring back at him from the darkened window. His suspicions were no longer nebulous. They had form, weight, and undeniable proof. The foundation of their marriage had been shaken, and Carlos knew it was only the beginning of a deeper unraveling. His fingers tightened around the edge of the counter as a cold resolve settled over him. Sylvia might deny it, deflect it, but the truth was already beginning to surface. The atmosphere in the living room was as tense as a coiled spring. Carlos sat on the edge of the couch, his fingers intertwined as if trying to hold himself together. Across from him, Sylvia stood with her arms crossed, her posture rigid but defiant. The air between them crackled with unspoken accusations. "You've been spending a lot of time with Pete Wallace," Carlos began, his tone calm but carrying an edge. He met her gaze, his surgical precision now turned toward the dissection of their crumbling marriage. "Too much time, I'd say." Sylvia rolled her eyes, letting out a sharp, bitter laugh. "So, this is what we're doing now, snooping through my messages and interrogating me like I'm on trial?" Carlos leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on his knees. "I didn't have to snoop, Sylvia. The messages were there for anyone to see, and you didn't exactly leave much to the imagination." Her face flushed, but she recovered quickly, tilting her chin upward. "Pete is a colleague, Carlos. We're working on projects that you clearly don't care about. Not everything is some grand conspiracy." His jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "Projects? Sylvia, the oncology department falls under my supervision. If there were any major changes or revolutionary proposals, I would know. Instead, I hear about it through your late-night meetings and texts about slit dresses." He let the words hang in the air, each syllable cutting deeper than the last. Sylvia's eyes flashed, her composure slipping for just a moment before she fired back. "Do you hear yourself? You're so busy trying to catch me in some imaginary scandal that you've forgotten what it feels like to support me. Pete appreciates my ideas, my ambition. He doesn't dismiss me like you do." Carlos blinked, stunned by the audacity of her words. He rose slowly, his height forcing Sylvia to tilt her head slightly to meet his eyes. "Dismiss you? Sylvia, I've supported every step of your career, every late-night study session, every move, every new position. I've been there, so don't stand there and act like I've clipped your wings." Sylvia's lips pressed into a thin line, her defenses hardening. "You supported me when it was convenient for you, Carlos, as long as I stayed in your shadow, playing the dutiful wife of the great Dr. Maloney. But the moment I started flying on my own, you decided I must be doing something wrong." Carlos took a deep breath, his voice dropping lower but no less intense. "Flying? Is that what you call this? Dressing like you're going to a nightclub for strategic meetings with a man who clearly doesn't respect professional boundaries?" Her eyes narrowed, and she stepped closer, pointing a manicured finger at his chest. "Don't you dare try to control how I dress. You have no idea what it's like to navigate the world as a woman, to be judged on everything from my hair to my shoes before I even open my mouth. Pete understands that. He respects me for who I am." Carlos's laugh was low and humorless. "Pete respects you? The man who leans across his car console to whisper things he wouldn't dare say in front of a room full of colleagues? The man who uses flattery to manipulate everyone around him? Pet listens to me," Sylvia snapped, her voice rising. "He values my opinion, my intelligence. He doesn't look at me like some accessory to his career. And maybe that's what you can't stand, that someone else sees me for who I really am." Carlos's calm facade finally cracked. "Who you really are. Sylvia, do you even see yourself anymore? You've lied to me, to our colleagues, to yourself. Whatever Pete says to you, it isn't respect, it's opportunism. And you're letting him destroy not just our marriage, but your integrity." Sylvia's mouth opened, then closed, her retort failing to form. She turned sharply, pacing a few steps away before spinning back toward him. "You think you know everything, don't you? With your degrees, your surgical brilliance, your spotless reputation. but you don't know what it's like to be underestimated, to be seen as nothing more than your wife." Carlos's voice softened, but it carried an unmistakable weight. "Maybe you felt that way, but I never saw you as just my wife. I saw you as my partner, someone I loved, someone I thought shared my values. But now," he shook his head, the words catching in his throat, "now I don't know who you are." For a moment, the only sound in the room was the ticking of the wall clock. Sylvia's face softened slightly, as if she were on the verge of saying something meaningful, something real. But then her defenses snapped back into place, her lips curving into a bitter smile. "I'm done having this conversation," she said flatly, grabbing her bag from the couch. "I have an early meeting with Pete tomorrow. We're finalizing the oncology proposal, in case you're interested, which I doubt." Carlos didn't stop her as she stormed out, the sound of her heels on the hardwood echoing through the house, like punctuation marks to an unfinished sentence. He stood there, staring at the closed door, feeling the weight of her words settle over him. Somewhere deep inside, he knew this confrontation wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of something far worse. The oncology department was eerily quiet late at night, the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional rustle of paper the only sounds. Tasha Newton, a diligent oncology nurse with a knack for detail, sat hunched over her desk, poring over patient records and trial reports. The discrepancies had started small, subtle inconsistencies in dosages and outcomes that most would overlook, but as she dug deeper, the patterns became impossible to ignore. Her heart raced as she flipped through the latest trial data. The efficacy rates were unusually high, suspiciously so. Even more troubling, severe adverse reactions, ones she had personally documented, were conspicuously absent from the official reports submitted to the FDA. Tasha pushed her chair back, the gravity of the situation settling over her like a weight. These weren't simple clerical errors. This was deliberate manipulation. Grabbing the files, she headed straight for Carlos Maloney's office, knowing he was one of the few people who would take her concerns seriously. Carlos was reviewing a patient's case notes when Tasha knocked, her face pale but determined. "Dr. Maloney, do you have a moment? It's important." He gestured for her to enter, noting the thick stack of papers she carried. "What's going on, Tasha?" She placed the files on his desk, her voice steady but low. "I've been reviewing the drug trial data for the new oncology treatment. Something's wrong. The numbers don't match the patient records. Adverse effects are being underreported, and the efficacy rates are, well, they're inflated." Carlos leaned forward, flipping through the documents. As he scanned the highlighted discrepancies, his brows furrowed. "These aren't just mistakes," he said quietly. "This looks intentional. Who's overseeing the data submission?" "Pete Wallace," Tasha said, her voice laced with tension. "And Sylvia. She's been handling the reporting from the hospital side." Carlos's hand froze mid-turn of a page. "Sylvia?" His voice betrayed a mix of disbelief and anger. Tasha nodded. "She has access to both the hospital's patient records and the pharmaceutical company's internal systems. If someone wanted to manipulate the data at both ends, she'd be in the perfect position to do it." Carlos closed the file, his jaw tightening. The pieces were falling into place. Sylvia's late nights, her evasive behavior, and her increasingly close relationship with Pete. But this wasn't just about personal betrayal anymore. This was about patient safety. Real lives were at stake. The next day, Carlos accessed the hospital's internal records, cross-referencing them with the trial data Tasha had flagged. It didn't take long to confirm her findings. Dosages had been adjusted in the official reports, and patient deaths attributed to unrelated causes were suspiciously consistent with known side effects of the trial drug. One patient in particular, a young woman in her 30s, had died from liver failure, a complication that was nowhere to be found in the submitted documents. Carlos felt the familiar pressure of responsibility building behind his temples. He wasn't just a husband confronting a failing marriage. He was a surgeon sworn to protect his patients. And now, he had evidence that Pete Wallace and likely Sylvia were endangering lives for profit. That evening, Carlos returned home later than usual, his mind racing. He opened the door to find Sylvia seated on the couch, casually scrolling through her phone. She looked up briefly. "Long day?" Carlos stared at her for a moment, his calm exterior masking the storm inside. "Very," he replied, his voice neutral. "But productive. I've been looking into the oncology trials you've been working on." Sylvia's fingers paused, but she quickly recovered. "Oh, what about them?" Carlos sat across from her, fixing her with a steady gaze. "The discrepancies, the altered data, the underreported adverse reactions. Care to explain?" Her face paled slightly before she forced a dismissive laugh. "Carlos, I don't know what you're talking about. That's Pete's department. I just assist with the logistics." Carlos didn't blink. "You're listed as a co-author on the reports. Your access credentials are on every altered record." The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Sylvia's facade cracked, her eyes flashing with a mix of anger and panic. "You've always needed to control everything, haven't you? This is why Pete values my input, because I'm not afraid to innovate." Carlos stood, his voice firm but restrained. "This isn't innovation, Sylvia. This is fraud, and it's putting lives at risk. You and Pete may have thought you could get away with it, but you're wrong." As he turned to leave, Sylvia called after him, her voice wavering. "What are you going to do?" "I have a book to write." Carlos didn't stop. "What I have to." With the evidence in hand and a resolve forged by betrayal, Carlos knew the next steps would be difficult, but he was determined to expose the truth, no matter the cost. Secrets of the Free World. Author Noan. The house was quiet when Carlos returned, his thoughts a whirlwind of anger and determination. He had promised himself he wouldn't confront Sylvia again until he had irrefutable proof. Tonight, he intended to find it. Sylvia had left earlier for another strategy meeting with Pete Wallace. Carlos knew he had limited time, but the suspicion gnawing at him was unbearable. He moved purposefully to her office, a meticulously organized space that mirrored her polished public persona. For a moment, he hesitated. His mind echoed with her accusations of mistrust, but he pushed the thought aside. Too much was at stake. The top drawers of her desk held nothing unusual. Pens, folders, a planner. It wasn't until he opened the bottom drawer and found a slim folder labeled Consulting Notes that his stomach turned. Inside were printed emails, handwritten notes, and a contract bearing Pete Wallace's signature alongside Sylvia's. One document caught his eye, an email dated 6 months before Sylvia had even joined the hospital. "Sylvia, your insight is invaluable. Securing Carlos's position at Metropolitan will give us the leverage we need. I'll handle the board. You focus on keeping him close. His reputation will make this project untouchable." Carlos felt the air leave his lungs. Sylvia hadn't just been complicit. She had been part of the plan from the start. She hadn't just waited until after the fact and forwarded the news and told everyone how it had happened. As he flipped through the pages, the picture became clearer. Correspondence between Pete and Sylvia revealed their strategy: gain Carlos's trust, use his influence to push trials, and manipulate hospital leadership to fast-track approvals. Sylvia's meticulous notes detailed timelines, key stakeholders, and even suggestions for how to redirect Carlos's attention when necessary. The sound of Sylvia's keys jingling at the front door jolted Carlos from his trance. He shoved the folder back into the drawer, closed it, and leaned casually against the doorframe just as she walked in. "You're home early," she said, her voice light but guarded as she set her bag down. Her perfectly styled hair and the faint scent of expensive perfume were incongruous with her claim of a long meeting. Carlos didn't respond immediately, his eyes following her as she moved toward the kitchen. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and steady. "Busy night?" Sylvia froze for a fraction of a second before turning to face him, her smile tight. "Just the usual, meetings, brainstorming, nothing exciting." Carlos nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. "Funny. because I found something exciting while I was here." He let the words linger, watching as her carefully composed expression flickered with unease. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice sharp but tinged with nervousness. He stepped forward, his tone calm yet cold. "The emails, the notes, the plan you and Pete orchestrated before you even set foot in this hospital." Sylvia's face drained of color. "You went through my desk?" she hissed, her voice rising. "I went looking for the truth," Carlos replied, his voice tightening, "and I found it. All of it. The meetings, the data manipulation, and how you used me as part of your scheme. How long, Sylvia? How long have you been lying to me?" He crossed her arms, defiant. "You don't understand. It wasn't like that. Pete saw my potential. He gave me opportunities you never would have." Carlos's laugh was bitter, cutting through her excuses. "Opportunities? You call this betrayal an opportunity? Manipulating patients' data, risking lives, and betraying your husband? What part of that is ambition?" Sylvia's veneer of control cracked, and her voice rose. "Do you think I enjoyed being in your shadow? Watching you get all the credit while I fought for scraps? Pete believed in me. He saw what I could achieve." Carlos's voice dropped, each word deliberate. "What you've achieved is irreparable harm, not just to our marriage, but to the very people we swore to protect." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Sylvia's defenses were crumbling, but she refused to back down. "You don't understand what it's like, Carlos. To feel invisible, to be dismissed." "No," he said firmly, his eyes locked on hers. "You don't understand what it's like to stand for something, to have integrity. You chose ambition over morality, and you've put everything we built at risk." She turned away, her back rigid. "You're blowing this out of proportion." Carlos stepped closer, his voice unwavering. "Am I? Because the FDA, the hospital board, and law enforcement won't think so." Sylvia whirled around, her eyes wide with panic. You wouldn't destroy everything we've built." Carlos shook his head slowly. "You already did." As he left the room, Sylvia's voice called after him, breaking with desperation. "Carlos, wait! We can fix this!" But Carlos didn't look back. The evidence in her desk had shattered whatever trust remained, and now, the only thing left was the truth, and the consequences that would follow. The Metropolitan Hospital's annual fundraiser was the highlight of the year, drawing philanthropists, board members, and medical professionals from across the city. The grand ballroom sparkled with chandeliers, the hum of polite conversation mingling with the clinking of glasses. Carlos arrived on time, his presence commanding respect as he greeted donors and colleagues. Yet, beneath his composed exterior, he was bracing for the storm he knew Sylvia would bring. The murmurs started before Carlos even saw her. Sylvia entered the room nearly 45 minutes late, dressed in a striking red gown with a thigh-high slit that drew every pair of eyes in the room. Conversations dipped as attendees exchanged knowing glances, and whispers of disapproval rippled through the crowd. Her outfit was a stark contrast to the conservative attire expected at such an event, a deliberate act that Carlos recognized immediately. From his position near the bar, Carlos watched her with a growing sense of unease. Sylvia's laughter rang out as she approached Pete Wallace, who stood near the center of the room, surrounded by a group of donors. Pete's gaze lingered on Sylvia's dress before he leaned in to whisper something that made her laugh even louder. Carlos took a steadying breath, setting his glass down. Nay Atkins appeared beside him, her clipboard in hand but her eyes focused on Sylvia and Pete. "She's making a scene," Nay said quietly. "She's making a statement," Carlos corrected, his tone clipped. "And it's not about the hospital." Pete raised his voice slightly, ensuring those nearby could hear. "Sylvia, you've outdone yourself tonight. That dress, it's bold, ambitious, just like you." His grin widened as he glanced toward Carlos, who had begun making his way across the room. "Dr. Maloney must be so proud." Sylvia's eyes locked with Carlos's as he approached, her smile tinged with defiance. "Carlos," she said sweetly, her tone carrying the subtle edge of mockery. "I was just telling Pete how excited I am about the new oncology initiatives. You know, the ones we've been working so hard on." Carlos stopped a few steps away, his expression controlled but his voice firm. "Yes, the initiatives you've conveniently neglected to discuss with me, despite them supposedly being part of my department." Pete stepped forward, his hands casually in his pockets. "Come on, Carlos," he said with an easy smile that only deepened Carlos's irritation. "Sylvia's been invaluable. She has a knack for seeing possibilities others might overlook." Carlos didn't take the bait, his gaze unwavering as he addressed Sylvia directly. "We need to talk. Privately." "Actually," Pete interjected, placing a hand lightly on Sylvia's arm, "Sylvia and I were just about to speak with the Hendersons about their potential donation. You understand, of course, business first." The surrounding group chuckled politely, but the tension was palpable. Carlos's jaw tightened as he looked at Pete's hand on Sylvia's arm, then back at Sylvia. Her expression was a mix of triumph and challenge, daring him to react. Dr. Maloney, one of the donors, chimed in, clearly uncomfortable with the tension. "Perhaps we could hear about your groundbreaking work in pediatric surgery. It's truly inspiring." Carlos nodded curtly, shifting his attention to the donor. "Of course. Excuse me." With that, he stepped away, though his back remained stiff, the weight of Pete and Sylvia's antics pressing heavily on him. The evening dragged on, with Pete and Sylvia drawing attention wherever they went. At one point, Carlos caught snippets of Sylvia's voice carrying across the ballroom as she spoke with a group of nurses. "Carlos is brilliant, no doubt," she said, her words dripping with mock affection. "But sometimes brilliance comes with rigidity. Pete's been such a breath of fresh air." Carlos clenched his fists at his side but kept walking. He couldn't afford a scene. Not here. Not now. The hospital's reputation depended on his restraint, even if every word out of Sylvia's mouth felt like a dagger. The final blow came during Pete's impromptu speech. Standing near the stage, he raised a glass, his tone casual but calculated. "I just want to take a moment to thank Sylvia Maloney for her incredible contributions to our oncology initiatives. Her vision and dedication have been nothing short of transformative." He turned to face Carlos, his smile widening. "Dr. Maloney, you're a lucky man to have such a driven partner." The crowd clapped politely, though several attendees exchanged uneasy glances. Carlos forced a thin smile, nodding once in acknowledgement. Inside, the frustration boiled. Pete wasn't just undermining his authority, he was systematically dismantling his reputation. As the applause died down, Carlos turned and walked toward the terrace, the cool evening air hitting him like a slap. He leaned against the railing, taking a deep breath as he tried to steady his thoughts. Nad joined him a moment later, her presence a grounding force. "They're baiting you," she said simply, "trying to make you react. Don't give them the satisfaction." Carlos's voice was low, his tone laced with quiet fury. "They've turned this fundraiser into a sideshow. This isn't about the hospital. It's about their ego." Na placed a hand on his arm. "Then let's refocus. The donors are here to support the hospital, not to watch drama unfold. They trust you, Carlos. Don't let Pete and Sylvia drag you down to their level." Re-entering the ballroom, Carlos moved with renewed purpose. He avoided Pete and Sylvia, instead engaging donors directly, sharing stories of patients whose lives had been changed by the hospital's work. Gradually, the focus shifted back to the cause, and the murmurs about Sylvia and Pete began to fade. But as the night wore on, Carlos couldn't shake the feeling that this public humiliation was only the beginning. Pete had proven his willingness to manipulate, and Sylvia had shown just how far she was willing to go. The fundraiser had laid bare the cracks in their relationship and their professional lives, and Carlos knew that those cracks were about to deepen into fractures. As the last guests trickled out and the ballroom emptied, Carlos stood alone for a moment, staring at the spot where Pete had delivered his speech. The damage had been done, but so had his resolve. Pete and Sylvia's public betrayal only strengthened his determination to expose the truth, no matter the cost. Carlos knew confronting Sylvia outright wouldn't yield results. She was too practiced at deflection and denial. Instead, he chose the path of quiet observation and strategic action, enlisting the help of Nina and Tasha to methodically gather the evidence needed to expose the truth. Tasha began combing through the hospital's internal patient records, comparing them against the official reports submitted to the FDA. "Carlos," she said during one late-night meeting in his office, her voice tinged with urgency. "Here's another one. This patient suffered severe cardiac issues, but the trial data lists the reaction as mild." She slid a file across the desk, her finger pointing to the discrepancies. Carlos nodded, his eyes scanning the records, his jaw tightening with each new inconsistency. "This isn't negligence, it's deliberate manipulation," Carlos muttered, jotting notes to connect patterns between altered cases. Nina, with her administrative access, quietly began retrieving files Sylvia had edited. "Here's something interesting," Nina said. Her voice hushed as she handed Carlos a printed email chain. Sylvia and Pete discussing revisions to the oncology trial data. They're blatantly deciding what gets reported and what doesn't. Carlos studied the emails, his expression dark. "This directly ties Sylvia to the fraud," he said. "We need to preserve timestamps and metadata for credibility." Nina's expertise in hospital operations uncovered financial transactions linking Pete to off-the-books payments. "These payments look like consulting fees," Nina explained. "But the timing aligns perfectly with Sylvia's late-night meetings. Pete's been funneling money to Sylvia under the radar." Carlos exhaled slowly. "This connects Pete's fraud to Sylvia's personal gain. It's the piece we need." Carlos sat in his office late into the night, the glow of the computer screen casting sharp shadows across his face. Stacks of files and printed emails surrounded him, the culmination of weeks of painstaking effort by him, Tasha, and Nina. Every document, every time-stamped email, and every financial transaction painted a damning picture. Pete Wallace had orchestrated a fraudulent scheme to manipulate drug trial results, and Sylvia had been complicit. Every step of the way. Carlos leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as he reread a particularly incriminating email. "Sylvia, we need the revised patient data by Monday. Keep the adverse reactions low. Dr. Maloney won't question it as long as we stay under the radar. Remember, the board is our real audience here, not the FDA." Pete's casual tone made Carlos's stomach churn. He slammed the file shut, his mind racing. Sylvia hadn't just been drawn into this recently. She had been working with Pete long before the trial even began. The sound of a knock at the door broke his thoughts. Nina stepped inside, her expression grim but resolute. "Carlos," she said, placing a thick folder on his desk. "I found more. Payments from Pete's pharmaceutical company routed through a third-party consulting firm. Guess whose name is on the invoices?" Carlos opened the folder, his eyes scanning the documents. Each invoice was signed by Sylvia, listed as a consultant for data analysis and strategic oversight. "Strategic oversight," Carlos repeated, his voice cold. "That's one way to describe altering patient outcomes." Nina hesitated before speaking. "There's more. I checked Pete's past hospitals. This isn't his first scheme. He's pulled the same fraud at 3 other institutions. And Sylvia, she was hired at each hospital shortly before Pete started his trial manipulations." Carlos stared at her, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. So, she wasn't just helping him. She's been his partner all along. Later that night, Carlos returned home, the evidence in hand. Sylvia was in the living room sipping a glass of wine. She glanced up as he walked in, her expression wary. Carlos joined her in the living room. "You're home late," she said casually, though her voice carried a faint edge. Carlos didn't respond immediately. Instead, he placed the folder on the coffee table between them and sat down across from her. We need to talk. Sylvia's smile faltered as she eyed the folder. What's this? Everything, Carlos said, his voice low but firm. Emails, invoices, altered trial data, proof of Pete's fraudulent schemes, and proof of your role in them. Sylvia's hand froze mid-reach for her glass. Her eyes darted to the folder, then back to Carlos. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, her voice tight. Carlos squeezed her hand. This is it, I think. Carlos opened the folder, pulling out the email chain. He slid it across the table to her. This is an email from Pete instructing you to alter patient data. And this, he added, pulling out the invoices, is proof that you were being paid to do it. Pete. Sylvia's face went pale, but she quickly recovered, forcing a defiant tone. This doesn't mean anything. Those were consulting fees. You're twisting everything to make me look guilty. Carlos's voice remained calm, though his eyes burned with anger. Sylvia, this isn't just about the money. Patients suffered because of these lies. People could have died, and you sat there helping Pete cover it up. Sylvia slammed her glass down on the table, her composure shattering. You don't understand, she snapped. Pete gave me opportunities. He believed in me when you didn't. All you ever cared about was your career, your reputation. My reputation? Carlos's voice rose slightly, the first crack in his calm exterior. Do you think I'm worried about my reputation? I care about the patients who trusted us. I care about the people whose lives you and Pete endangered for profit. Sylvia's eyes filled with tears, but her expression hardened. Do you know what it's like to always be second? To always be Carlos Maloney's wife, never taken seriously on my own? Pete gave me a way out. Carlos shook his head slowly, his voice heavy with disappointment. You had a choice, Sylvia. You could have made something of yourself without destroying everything around you. But you didn't, and now you're going to face the consequences. Sylvia slumped back into her chair, her defiance waning. What are you going to do? She asked, her voice trembling. Carlos stood, gathering the folder. What I should have done, weeks ago. I'm taking this to the board and the authorities. The hospital, the FDA, everyone will know the truth. As he walked out of the room, Sylvia's voice followed him, desperate and pleading. Carlos, wait, we can fix this, please. But he didn't stop. The weight of betrayal was crushing, but his resolve was stronger. The evidence was clear, and now it was time to act. Lives were at stake, and Carlos would not let Pete or Sylvia's schemes go unanswered. Carlos sat at the head of the conference table in the hospital's administrative wing, his hands resting on the thick folder of evidence that had consumed his life for weeks. Beside him, Nina scrolled through a tablet, her precise notes ready for their next steps. Across the table, Tasha leaned forward, her expression a mixture of determination and unease. It's time, Carlos said, his voice steady but weighted with resolve. We've compiled everything, the altered data, the financial transactions, and the emails. The FDA and law enforcement need to see this. Nina nodded, her tone matter-of-fact. I've already contacted the FDA's Criminal Investigation Unit. Special Agent Torres is expecting us. We just need to deliver the package. Later that afternoon, the trio entered the federal office downtown. The sterile walls and brisk atmosphere only heightened their sense of urgency. Special Agent Torres, a sharp-eyed woman with an air of authority, greeted them in a small, secured meeting room. You must be Dr. Maloney, she said, shaking Carlos's hand firmly. We've heard good things about your work, but this? She gestured to the evidence they'd brought. This is serious. Carlos met her gaze evenly. Patients' lives are at risk. This goes beyond malpractice. It's criminal. Nina stepped forward, placing the folder on the table. Here's everything we've documented. Altered trial data, payments funneled through shell companies, and communications between Pete Wallace and Sylvia Maloney. It's a coordinated effort to manipulate drug trials for profit. Torres opened the folder, her sharp gaze scanning the documents. You've done a lot of the legwork already, she said, impressed, but we'll need to corroborate this with independent audits and interviews. Tasha, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. We've identified patterns in Pete Wallace's previous hospital trials. He's done this before, and the outcomes were buried. Patients died. Torres's expression darkened. If that's true, we're looking at charges far beyond fraud, potential manslaughter, maybe worse. As the meeting wrapped up, Torres stood, her tone decisive. We'll move quickly. Pete Wallace won't have time to destroy evidence. And as for your wife, she added, glancing at Carlos, we'll investigate her role thoroughly. Carlos exhaled, his jaw tightening. She'll have to answer for what she's done, but my priority is the patients. Their safety comes first. As they left the building, the weight on Carlos's shoulders lifted slightly. The wheels of justice were in motion, and for the first time, the end of Pete and Sylvia's scheme felt within reach. But he knew the fight wasn't over yet. The sterile walls of the Metropolitan Hospital's chief surgeon's office were stripped bare, the personal touches that once filled the space now packed away in brown boxes. Carlos stood in the empty room, the weight of his decision pressing heavily on his chest. This office had been the center of his career, a place where he had saved countless lives. Now it felt like a monument to betrayal, not just Sylvia's, but his own, for staying blind to the cracks in their marriage and the ethical failures happening under his watch. That morning, Carlos had met with the hospital board. The room had been tense, the air thick with the fallout from the FDA investigation. Pete Wallace's arrest and Sylvia's role in the fraud had made national headlines, and the hospital's reputation was in tatters. I've submitted my resignation, Carlos announced, sliding the letter across the table. The board chair, an older man who had always admired Carlos's work, sighed deeply. Dr. Maloney, you're one of the finest surgeons we've ever had. Are you sure about this? Carlos nodded, his voice steady. My presence here has become a distraction. The hospital needs to rebuild its trust with the community, and that process starts with a clean slate. I'm leaving for the sake of the institution. And myself. The room fell silent. Despite their protests, the board members knew he was right. Returning to his now empty office, Carlos leaned against the desk, staring out the window. Metropolitan had been his home, his identity, but now it was time to let go. A knock on the door broke his thoughts. Nina stepped inside, her expression a mix of sadness and resolve. You really are leaving then, she said quietly. Carlos offered a small smile. It's the right move. For me, for the hospital. Nina crossed her arms, leaning against the doorframe. So, Seattle? He nodded. They've offered me a position at a pediatric care center. It's a fresh start, and after everything, I think that's exactly what I need. Nina hesitated, then stepped closer. Well, they're lucky to have you. And for what it's worth, you'll be missed here. The evening of his departure, Carlos returned to the house he had once shared with Sylvia. She was gone, having moved out after her deal with federal authorities placed her under witness protection. The house felt hollow, a shell of the life they had built together. On the kitchen counter, he left a handwritten note. This is from Watermark. You wanted freedom? Now you have it. I hope you find what you're looking for. Carlos placed the keys and his hospital ID beside the note, took one last look around, and walked out the door. In Seattle, Carlos's life took on a new rhythm. The Pacific Northwest Pediatric Care Center offered him not just a job, but a sense of purpose. He immersed himself in his work, focusing on the young lives he could save. The city's rain-soaked streets mirrored his own sense of renewal, washing away the remnants of his old life. One evening, as Carlos stood in his new office, a knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was Nina, holding 2 cups of coffee. You're here, he said, surprised but not entirely shocked. Resolved to walk to work. I took the development director position, Nina replied, smiling. You didn't think I'd let you rebuild alone, did you? Carlos chuckled softly, a warmth spreading through him. For the first time in months, he felt the stirrings of hope. Not just for his career, but for his life. Together, they began to build something new, stronger, and rooted in integrity. For Carlos, Seattle wasn't just a new city. It was a second chance, a place to rediscover himself, and the values that had always guided him. The courtroom was stifling, its heavy atmosphere amplifying Sylvia's growing anxiety. She sat at the defendant's table, her once flawless composure replaced by a nervous rigidity. The whispers of spectators rippled through the room, each word a knife cutting through her already fragile defenses. The trial was not just about her complicity in Pete Wallace's schemes. It was a public unraveling of the life she had built. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Karen Ellis, addressed the court. The evidence is clear. Sylvia Maloney knowingly participated in falsifying drug trial data, risking patients' lives for financial gain. Her actions were not a momentary lapse in judgment, but a calculated decision to support Pete Wallace's criminal enterprise. Sylvia flinched as Karen held up copies of incriminating emails. Each word was a damning echo of her role in the conspiracy. The courtroom buzzed as Karen continued. Mrs. Maloney's cooperation with federal authorities, while significant, does not erase the harm she has caused. We urge the court to consider the gravity of her actions. When it was Sylvia's turn to speak, she stood, clutching the edges of the table. Her voice trembled as she began. I made terrible mistakes. I won't deny it, but I wasn't the mastermind. Pete Wallace manipulated me, used my ambition against me. She paused, scanning the room for sympathy that wasn't there. I've lost everything, my marriage, my career, my reputation. I only hope my cooperation will help prevent this from happening again. Her words hung in the air, but the courtroom remained silent. Even her attempt at redemption felt hollow. The judge's sentence came swiftly, 2 years of supervised probation and a requirement to testify in Pete Wallace's case. However, due to her extensive cooperation, she avoided prison time. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed her. Flashes from cameras blinded her as questions bombarded her from every direction. Sylvia, how does it feel to betray your husband and patients? Alice's voice is calm and icy. Do you regret your involvement? What do you have to say to the victims? Sylvia kept her head down, her hands trembling. Federal agents guided her into a waiting car, the door slamming shut on the cacophony of public disgrace, one after another, in lengthy succession. Weeks later, Sylvia sat in a drab apartment in Arizona under a new name and identity, courtesy of witness protection. Her polished exterior was gone, replaced by plain clothes and a haunted expression. Her days were now filled with quiet regret and solitude. As she stared at the blank walls, her thoughts often wandered to Carlos. Despite her anger and resentment toward him during their marriage, she realized now that he had been her moral anchor. Without him, she had drifted too far into ambition, losing herself completely. In the silence, Sylvia resolved to change. She began volunteering at a local shelter, helping women escape manipulative relationships. Though her path to redemption was long, it was the only way she knew to make amends for the lives she had helped endanger. Her life as Sylvia Maloney was over, but perhaps in anonymity, she could find a new beginning. The Pacific Northwest Pediatric Care Center had become a beacon of hope for children and families across Seattle. Under Carlos's leadership, it transformed into one of the most innovative facilities in the country. The halls were filled with vibrant murals, the hum of activity, and the laughter of children. Each moment a reminder of why Carlos had chosen this path. In the mornings, Carlos would walk through the center, greeting staff and chatting with young patients. It wasn't just a job, it was a calling that reignited his passion for medicine. And he wasn't alone in this journey. Nina, now the center's development director, worked tirelessly alongside him, their partnership growing stronger with each passing day. One rainy afternoon, Carlos sat in his office reviewing a proposal for a new surgical wing. His concentration was broken by a soft knock at the door. Nina stepped in, holding 2 steaming mugs of coffee. "You're making us look bad, working through lunch again," she teased, setting a cup on his desk. Carlos chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "Just try to keep up with you." Her gaze softened. You've built something incredible here, Carlos. The kids, the families, they see you as more than just a doctor. You've given them hope. Before he could respond, there was another knock at the door. It was Jason, clutching a folder filled with his latest drawings. The boy, now 6 years old, had found a home and stability he never thought possible. Carlos hadn't planned on becoming a father, especially not under such complicated circumstances. Jason, the son of Sylvia and Pete, had been left without guardianship after the scandal unraveled. Initially, the boy was shy, withdrawn, and unsure of his place in the world. But as Carlos spent more time with him, he saw flashes of resilience and curiosity, qualities he admired deeply. One evening, as Jason sat coloring at the kitchen table, Carlos joined him, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "What's this one?" he asked, pointing to a vibrant sketch of a house surrounded by trees. "It's our house," Jason said quietly, looking up at Carlos. "Our home." The simplicity of the statement struck Carlos deeply. He smiled, ruffling Jason's hair. "It's beautiful, buddy." The decision to formally adopt Jason was one Carlos made without hesitation. Over dinner one evening, he broached the subject with Nina, whose unwavering support had been a cornerstone of his new life. "Jason's been through so much," Carlos said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "He deserves more than just a place to stay. He deserves a family." Nina reached across the table, placing her hand over his. "You've already given him that, Carlos, but if making it official will give him more security, then I think it's the right thing to do." The adoption process brought its own challenges, but each step reaffirmed Carlos's commitment to Jason. When the day finally arrived, Jason clung to Carlos's hand as the judge signed the final paperwork. "Congratulations," the judge said with a warm smile. "You're officially a family." Jason beamed up at Carlos. "Does this mean you're my real dad now?" Carlos knelt down, meeting Jason's eyes. "I've been your dad from the moment you came into my life. This just makes it official." As the rain drizzled outside the center's windows, Carlos, Nina, and Jason gathered in the family room of their Seattle home. Jason's laughter echoed as he showed off his latest masterpiece, a drawing of the three of them standing under a rainbow. For Carlos, life had come full circle. The betrayal and pain of the past had given way to a future filled with purpose, love, and redemption. Seattle wasn't just a new city. It was a second chance to build the life he'd always dreamed of, one centered on integrity, hope, and family. The Arizona heat shimmered on the horizon as Sylvia adjusted the stack of papers on her desk. She stood at the front of a small sunlit classroom filled with curious young faces. Teaching high school science wasn't the life she had envisioned for herself, but it was the one she had now. For Sylvia, every day was a step toward redemption, a chance to rebuild the integrity she had lost. Her transformation hadn't come easily. After leaving witness protection, Sylvia struggled to find her footing. The weight of her past mistakes, manipulating data, risking lives, betraying Carlos, was a shadow she couldn't escape. Volunteering at a local women's shelter became her first step toward atonement. Listening to the stories of survivors gave her a deeper understanding of her own manipulation and the consequences of her choices. One day, as she organized supplies in the shelter, a young woman named Olivia approached her, hesitantly. "You used to work in a hospital, right?" Olivia asked, her voice soft. Sylvia nodded. "I did." "I want to be a nurse," Olivia said, her tone both hopeful and uncertain, "but I don't know if I'm smart enough." Sylvia knelt to meet Olivia's gaze. "You are," she said firmly. "It's not about being perfect. It's about having the courage to start and the determination to keep going." Inspired by moments like these, Sylvia began volunteering at local schools, offering science workshops and mentoring students. Her passion for teaching grew, and soon she earned a position as a full-time science teacher. In the classroom, she found a new sense of purpose. Lessons about chemical reactions and ecosystems became metaphors for resilience and growth. One afternoon, as her students filed out, one lingered behind. A boy named Marcus, who often stayed quiet, approached her desk. "Ms. Meyer," he began, using the new name she'd adopted. Thanks for helping me with that project. I didn't think I could do it, but I guess I can. Sylvia smiled, her heart warming. You always could, Marcus. You just needed someone to remind you. Ah. In quiet moments at home, Sylvia often reflected on her past. Her work in the classroom and at the shelter gave her a way to honor the lives she had once endangered. Though she would never undo the harm she caused, she was determined to use the rest of her life to make a positive impact. For Sylvia, redemption wasn't about erasing her mistakes. It was about facing them, learning from them, and dedicating herself to helping others avoid the same pitfalls. Each day brought new challenges, but also new opportunities for growth, and she embraced them wholeheartedly. The scandal surrounding Pete Wallace and Sylvia Maloney shook the medical community to its core, but it also became a catalyst for sweeping reforms. Congress passed the Medical Trial Integrity Act, a landmark piece of legislation that set stricter standards for pharmaceutical trials. The law mandated comprehensive oversight, transparent reporting, and severe penalties for data manipulation, ensuring patient safety remained the top priority. The case also inspired the creation of independent ethics boards across major hospitals nationwide, tasked with auditing trial data and investigating potential conflicts of interest. These boards became a critical safeguard, preventing the exploitation of vulnerable patients. Metropolitan Hospital, once mired in scandal, emerged as a leader in patient safety. Under the guidance of new leadership, including Dr. Sarah Chen, the hospital implemented rigorous protocols for trial oversight and whistleblower protections. Its transformation became a model for healthcare institutions across the country, demonstrating that accountability and integrity could rebuild trust. Carlos, though no longer part of Metropolitan, was invited to speak at conferences and forums about the importance of ethics in medicine. His story, once defined by betrayal, became a symbol of resilience and the power of standing for what's right. Jason grew into a thoughtful and principled young man, shaped by Carlos's example. By the time he reached his 20s, Jason had decided to follow in Carlos's footsteps, choosing a career in medicine. However, his focus wasn't on surgery, but on medical ethics and research integrity. I want to make sure what happened to you and to those patients never happens again, Jason told Carlos one evening as they sat in the living room, the Seattle rain pattering against the windows. Carlos smiled, pride evident in his eyes. You're already making a difference, Jason. Being compassionate and principled is more powerful than any title. Jason's dedication was unwavering. Inspired by his adoptive father, he worked to create systems that prioritized honesty and transparency in research, ensuring that integrity remained at the heart of medicine for generations to come. The Pete Wallace scandal, once a story of greed and betrayal, transformed into a watershed moment for medical ethics. The Medical Trial Integrity Act, passed unanimously by Congress, became the cornerstone of a new era in healthcare. The law introduced mandatory independent audits for all pharmaceutical trials, required transparent reporting of adverse effects, and imposed severe penalties for fraudulent practices. For the first time, patient safety and data integrity were safeguarded by a robust legal framework. In fact, at the forefront of this change was Metropolitan Hospital, once tarnished by scandal but now a shining example of reform. Under the leadership of Dr. Sarah Chen, the hospital implemented comprehensive protocols that prioritized transparency and accountability. Whistleblower protections were strengthened, and ethics training became a core part of medical education. These reforms not only restored the hospital's reputation, but set a new standard for institutions across the country. Carlos Maloney's role in exposing the fraud became a powerful story of courage and conviction. He was invited to testify before Congress, sharing his experience to advocate for stronger regulations. His speeches at medical conferences inspired a generation of healthcare professionals to hold integrity above all else. Medicine is not just about saving lives, Carlos said during one keynote address. It's about earning the trust of those who place their lives in our hands. That trust must never be compromised. The scandal's impact rippled beyond the healthcare system. Universities began incorporating ethics courses into their medical programs, ensuring future professionals understood the grave consequences of ethical breaches. Across the nation, hospitals adopted Metropolitan's model, creating a culture where honesty and accountability thrived. For Carlos, the legacy of the scandal wasn't just about institutional reform. It was deeply personal. Jason, the boy who had come into his life under tragic circumstances, grew into a principled and compassionate young man. Inspired by Carlos's unwavering integrity, Jason chose a career in medical ethics, determined to ensure transparency and fairness in pharmaceutical research. One evening, as they sat together in the family room, Jason shared his thoughts. "Dad, I used to think about where I came from, how I might be like them." He paused, his voice steady but introspective. "But I've realized that where I go and who I become is what matters." Carlos placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "Jason, you've already proven that. Your past doesn't define you. Your choices do. And you've made choices I couldn't be prouder of." Jason smiled, his resolve clear. "Then I want to make sure others can make those choices too, without fear or manipulation. It's what you've always taught me." Carlos's journey, marked by betrayal and redemption, had taught him the profound power of forgiveness, not just of others, but of himself. Though Sylvia's actions had caused immeasurable harm, Carlos had come to accept that her journey was hers to reconcile. The scandals, the broken relationships, and even the losses had given him something unexpected, a renewed sense of purpose. Standing on the terrace of the Pacific Northwest Pediatric Care Center one quiet evening, Carlos reflected on the legacy of those turbulent years. The scandals that had nearly destroyed him had also become a clarion call for reform and a testament to the strength of resilience. Patients were safer, research was more honest, and young professionals like Jason were shaping a brighter future for medicine. "Sometimes," Carlos mused aloud, as Nina joined him with a cup of coffee, "we have to lose everything we thought we needed to find what truly matters." Nina smiled, her presence a steadying force. "And sometimes we have to be the light that guides others through the darkness." As the Seattle rain drizzled softly in the background, Carlos knew that the scandal, though painful, had become a beacon of hope. It was no longer a story of betrayal. It was a story of transformation, trust, and the enduring power of doing what's right. Carlos stood in the warm glow of the Pediatric Care Center, Jason and Nina by his side, their laughter filling the room. Reflecting on the trials that once shattered his life, he now saw them as catalysts for profound growth. The Wallace-Myers scandal, though rooted in betrayal, had ignited reforms that safeguarded countless lives and restored trust in medicine. His chosen family embodied resilience and integrity, proof that redemption was possible through truth and courage. As Carlos watched Jason inspire others with the same principles he held dear, he realized that even the darkest times could light the way for hope and change.